Hello and welcome to a new video from Dazatron's Diorama Llama, the channel dedicated to helping or encouraging beginners to make their own diorama bases. Well, I can't believe this is my first diorama of 2025, but I've finally had some inspiration. So as you can see here, we have Metamorpho, my favourite comic character growing up. And I'm so pleased to say that he's finally had his live action appearance in the James Gunn Superman movie. And if you don't know who Metamorpho is, well, here are a few kind of previews of his Silver Age comics. He's a character that was created by Ramona Fradon and Bob Haney. And he started way back in Brave and the Bold, between 1964 and 1965. And some of the comics that you see here are drawn by Ramona Fradon, Charles Paris and Sal Trapani. I think that's how it's pronounced. But a fantastic and bizarre character who can basically change his chemical makeup and turn himself into any element on the periodic table. So he's a fantastic character, and I've followed him since the 1980s, really, with Justice League Europe. So, yes, he appeared in, or has appeared in, the new Superman film, which if you haven't seen, I would highly encourage you to make it. And so, as you can see from what I'm holding in my hand there, this diorama is going to become the Fortress of Solitude. So this is kind of the ice kind of base, where I suppose it's kind of Superman's kind of safe haven when he's not kind of fighting crime, really. So the purpose of this diorama was to use up some of the offcuts that I've encouraged you to keep if you've been making some of these bases before now. I've always said keep hold of all the offcuts because you'll be able to use them again. So I've just got a piece here. I'm not going to give you the size of this because it doesn't need to be a specific size. You just need an offcut. These kind of crystals are about kind of 1 centimetre or 1.5 centimetres, slightly below kind of 1/2 inch. And of course, you don't want the more specific sizes. You want them to be various kind of thicknesses to kind of really give the impression. So as you can see here, I'm just kind of tapering the ends of what will become a crystal, just giving that more of a kind of a pointy kind of shape. And then I'll do the same to the bottom. So you do want a kind of a tapered kind of finish, with it being thinner at the bottom and then being slightly kind of wider at the top. And then just use a little bit of sandpaper just to kind of smooth down the edges, because I think with these it's really important that they look like they're made of ice. You don't want them to look like they're made of rock. So you can see I've already kind of prepared a few here. And when you kind of clump them together, it starts to give that feel of these kind of crystals growing out of this kind of ice structure. So I've got another offcut here. So this one's about 5 inches, just over. In terms of the thickness, I think it's about 2 inches. So I'm just going to check it out against the figure that's going to be presented on this base. Obviously, you don't have to use Metamorpho if you've got a Superman figure. That would be ideal, but I actually think this diorama would suit many figures from many different toy lines. So just use your imagination, really. So I'm just using a floristry knife. That's just a knife with a long blade. You can use whatever you've got at hand. A long blade tends to work better. And as you can see there, I don't want it to be a really smooth cut. The textures that you get from making a rough cut with these knives actually help to kind of create the texture in the rocks, and it kind of adds a bit more interest really to the diorama itself. So as you can see here, I'm trying to kind of create this indent, and this will kind of create a little bit of false perspective. It's also similar to the kind of the source material that I've been looking at. So I found an image from the Superman set that I've used as inspiration. So I've just kind of created this triangular shape, and I'm just using the knife, and you tend to find you do have to kind of keep going over it and over it until you can kind of release the styrofoam. The nice thing about using the knife as opposed to an electric styrofoam cutter is the fact that there's no fumes. So it's a much safer process. If you are going to use a styrofoam cutter, yeah, fantastic, but it will give you a much smoother cut, which you can then kind of rough up and add texture to later, so that's not a problem. You will find it will be quite difficult, certainly with a handheld foam cutter, to create this kind of indent. If you're using a tabletop cutter, you could always kind of piece a couple of or join a couple of pieces together to kind of form a similar thing. But if you just want something that you could do really easy, just grab a knife that you've got in your tool drawer and just start hacking at the styrofoam, and you'll get the kind of the effect that you want, really. So I'm just trying to decide whether to attach the kind of the base that Metamorpho will stand on to the front of this kind of backdrop, or whether to place, as you can see here, the backdrop on top of the base. So because I want that back kind of wall to be a bit higher, I've decided to add it on top of the base. So I'm just kind of scoring out a rough shape. I don't want this diorama to be symmetrical, and I want a little bit of space for another kind of rock face at the front of the diorama that I can add more of these crystals to. So you can see I've left a bit more space on the left hand side to kind of add that in a little bit later. And then, just as we did before, you can sharpen your knife first. It does make it cut much easier if you sharpen the knife. But because, again, I want quite a rough cut, I'm just literally kind of sawing with the knife, really, to get that shape that I want. And the beauty of this process is that if it doesn't work out the way you want it to, you can easily kind of adjust it later and get the finish that you're looking for. So don't worry if things go a little bit wrong and it's not how you imagine it to be. Now, obviously, the tutorial is here is just giving you one way you could do this. There's lots of ways that you could do something very similar. So you don't have to stick rigidly to what I'm showing you here. So I'm happy with the height of the background. I'm happy with the shape of the base itself. And so I'm just going to cut away a little bit more of this kind of rock face at the back. So you'll notice with the longer knives, it just slices really easy. So I'm just chipping away. Now, as I'm doing this, and this is the beauty of this technique, you'll start to make adjustments to your kind of plans. So you can see this kind of triangular part at the bottom there. I'm deciding to keep that in the end rather than removing it. But I am starting to remove some of that kind of rough cut, as I want to kind of create a bit of false perspective. So I'm going to use the knife to kind of cut in some ridges that would give the impression then that the rock face is going away from you. So you can see there I'm cutting at an angle, and I'm cutting into that kind of middle kind of groove. And then on the other side, I'll do the same again, but the opposite way. So it's almost kind of like a mirror effect. So because this kind of rough cut was very rough, if it was a different type of rock face, I'd probably keep it as it is. But because this is meant to be made out of ice, I just want to smooth it down a little bit. And again, with the longer knife, you can kind of flatten the blade against the styrofoam, and you can kind of put away, just kind of slice some kind of thinner areas, so you're not kind of removing too much at one time. It just gives you that little bit more control, really. So I'm trying to keep that kind of, that edge in the middle. So it almost looks like this is kind of a corner. So already I think that's looking better. So I found a piece of styrofoam that I'd already started cutting a while ago and just never used it. And again, the beauty of these makes is that you can kind of reuse things that you've kind of left to one side. So I'm just going to cut this down, chip away at this kind of block, just so it kind of matches up with the curves of the base, so it doesn't kind of stick out a bit too much. So that kind of fits a little bit better there. I quite like the way that the rock on here is kind of slanted. Again, that just gives me a little bit more space when I'm adding the figure in place. So I'm just going to tidy up a little bit. But again, all of these little offcuts, I'm keeping them for another day, because you just never know when you might need them. So I'm just going to place my figure in situ so I can just get a rough idea if it fits, and it does, it fits really well. And now I've made a few of these kind of crystals, I'm just going to go ahead and make a whole bunch so I can use them a bit later. So just the same process as before. You just want to taper them down so that they're more narrow at the bottom, a little bit wider at the top. In terms of like how many faces you put on the crystal, that's completely up to you. So with that kind of smaller rock, I've noticed that it does kind of restrict the space. So I'm just going to, again, cut another wedge in the middle of that, which just gives a little bit more space for the figure's feet. And just, yeah, just kind of creates a bit more space, really. Yeah, so I didn't like the corners of the rock face in the background, so I'm just kind of chipping away at those corners just to make it look more natural. And really, when you come to do this, it's simply a case of putting your knife in and flicking upwards. So you're actually almost kind of you're not cutting all the way through. You're letting the material do a lot of the work for you. So you're making a cut and then chipping off some of the styrofoam. And so, as I said, the material then, as it kind of breaks off, kind of creates some of that texture. Now, I'm not keen on the texture on this side of the styrofoam. This is where I've used a saw blade. So it's a much rougher texture to what you find on styrofoam in its kind of natural form. So you can see there's my source material. And I quite like the fact there's this kind of almost like kind of cave or this kind of hole in the background. So I thought, well, I'm going to add that just to add a bit of interest. So I'm just using the very point of the knife, just in a circular motion, and just kind of picking out the bits, really. Again, because this is a rock face, you don't have to be perfect with it. So already that's looking more interesting. So I just need to tidy up now the kind of the rough cuts of the crystals. Because they're a crystal, as I said earlier, you want them to look smooth. You want them to almost be kind of have a polished kind of finish to them. So it's really important that you use the sandpaper just to make those edges much flatter, much smoother. So I'm just taking a kind of a mini file just to kind of dig into the styrofoam, and this will just kind of create a space to push the crystals into, so that when we glue them, they're going to hold much better and be much firmer. And we don't want to just stick them on top of the rock. So you only need to leave a little bit of space in between the holes. Obviously, you don't want the holes to be right next to one another, as you'll probably find they won't kind of hold in firmly enough. So just leaving a little bit of space in between each hole would just kind of help them stay quite secure. Now, again, if you had an electric foam cutter, you do tend to have a rod tool, so you can make holes quite easily. Do be careful if you're using that, because it really does melt the styrofoam. Obviously, that would create fumes, so you need to make sure you are in a well-ventilated area and that you have the appropriate kind of gear, really, so you don't inhale those fumes. So I'm just deciding where to place the crystals on this kind of small rock. Again, so I can make sure there's enough space for the character to sit, really. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think there's enough interest there. You certainly do want to have these clusters of crystals, and you could add more if you wanted to. So I'm just using this Gorilla Grab adhesive. I've used lots of Gorilla Glue in the past when kind of attaching styrofoam to one another. I have to say, I haven't used this glue for quite a while, and it was really stiff to kind of push out. I did manage to do it. So you only need a small amount, but you can use whatever glue you've got at hand. Do check the instructions though, and just make sure that it's safe with styrofoam. It will tell you if it melts styrofoam, so you haven't got to kind of second guess it. Then with this grab adhesive, you've got about 10 minutes. So it gave me a little bit of time just to try and push out some more of the adhesive. And you don't need a huge amount to attach these pieces together. And because it's grab adhesive, one, you can kind of reposition. And two, it does stick pretty quickly, so that it kind of holds its position quite well when you're trying to adjust things or do anything else that you need to kind of do to the diorama. For it to actually stick permanently, you do need to leave it for 24 hours. So I've just added some to the back wall. I've done the same, obviously, to the end of each of the crystals and place them back in the holes. And then I'm just going to leave that overnight, and then that should mean that everything is nice and secure for when I come to do the paintwork, or if I need to make any kind of minor adjustments a little bit later on. Then when you're clumping together these crystals, it's a really good idea to have them at different heights and different kind of thicknesses. It just makes it look more interesting. So there's kind of Metamorpho in position with this kind of at this kind of earlier stage, just to kind of check if it's working. And I've just decided I wanted another crystal in place a little bit lower down on the right hand side here, so I'm just adding that in. And that's the beauty of this technique, is that you can kind of keep making those adjustments. So at the moment, it looks a bit weird in the way that the crystals are kind of just stuck into the rock. So I wanted to kind of add this kind of textural element, which might almost look like little ice crystals. So whenever you saw styrofoam, it kind of leaves this kind of residue that I've used many times before for things like soil and dirt and sand. So again, it's definitely worthwhile keeping hold of all these little bits, because they certainly do come in handy. So I'm just using regular PVA this time, as it's much thinner. I haven't thinned down the PVA, but but you don't want to be using anything like kind of super glue, because obviously it kind of hardens a bit too quick. So with the PVA, because again it takes a good 24 hours to dry out, it just gives you a bit of time, and will also help with the smoothing out and kind of getting into some of those more kind of difficult areas. So I'm just actually using a kebab stick there just to scrape off this kind of PVA and styrofoam mixture. And then I'm just using the pointy part just to kind of push that into all of the crevices. So again, it looks like these crystals are kind of growing out of these smaller crystals. So it is a bit fiddly, this part, trying to get into all those areas, but it will pay off in the end. So because the PVA mixture's quite loose, it kind of falls apart quite easily. So you do need to kind of spend a bit of time just trying to smooth it into the surface. So in that little hole, I quite like the idea of these smaller crystals kind of growing out. So I've just taken, again, just a really small piece of styrofoam, and just the same technique, I'm just tapering the edges, and then I'm actually just kind of just gently pushing this into the kind of the PVA and styrofoam mixture, which is kind of holding it in place. And because they're so small, they should hold in that position quite easily. And so there we have the kind of finished sculpt, really, before it's painted. So I'm pretty happy with the way that that's looking. Again, you could add more crystals to this if you wanted to. You can make the base a little bit larger, so you could have two figures. It really is up to you, but I'm pretty happy with that. As you can see, I've also added that mixture to all of the areas where the pieces have been joined together, just so it kind of gets rid of those joins, and it just kind of looks a bit more kind of finished, really. So this is after 24 hours, so I can kind of maneuver this a little bit more without things dropping off. Again, just checking that I'm happy with the way the figure stands there. And then looking back at the source material, it's now deciding what colours to use. And as you can see, the kind of the eye structure is more of a bluish tone, whereas the crystals are much whiter. So I'm just using cobalt blue, which is just a cheap acrylic from a kind of a hobby store. These aren't expensive acrylics. And I'm just using a general kind of white acrylic. So you can see I've already made a kind of a test piece here, just to try and get the blue and the white to kind of blend together. And that tends to work better while the paint is wet. So as you apply the kind of the first coat of white, just dip your brush into a little bit of the cobalt blue and try and go in the direction of the rock formation. So I'm using a round brush here, so it's got a more of a pointed end, so I can get into, again, all of those crevices. It's quite hard to paint that PVA and styrofoam mixture, so you do need to kind of dab it and try and get in there. You might even need to add a little bit of water to the mixture. So I'm just using white, pure white on its own, because I do want there to be a distinction between the two pieces. And I'm just using a bit of a heat gun to just kind of finish off that initial coat. If you are using a heat gun, don't hold it too close to the styrofoam, as it could melt and distort the structure. So you can see here I'm using the cobalt blue and the white again, but I've added some water to the mixture. And what I found is, as I've started to paint with this kind of more watered down mixture, it's just covering up that texture, it's giving a more of a smoother finish. Because this is an ice structure, I want it to look smoother. So it's definitely worthwhile, after you've given that initial coat, to go over the surface again, but with a watered down version of the white and the blue. And you can see how it kind of just fills in all of those tiny little kind of holes that you can see, which is just the natural texture of the styrofoam. So you can see there, I've got that combination of the kind of cobalt blue and the white. I found as it's dried out, the blue has kind of got a little bit darker. So I'm just going over the top again with some watered down white, and again in the direction of the cuts that I made earlier, just to kind of emphasize the ice structure. And again, just so it doesn't look quite so blue. Now, although as I'm adding this white, it looks really strong. It almost looks like I've added too much. Again, when it dries out, it will fade slightly. So don't worry. At the end of the day, if you do make a mistake, you can just add some more blue over the top. So again, with the other side, moving in the direction of the cuts that I made with the knife, just to kind of emphasize the texture. And then I'm just going over the crystals once more. I did find that I had to do this a few times, particularly on the crystals, because of the colour fade. And I also wanted it to be lighter at the base of the crystal. If you look online at Fortress of Solitude dioramas, there's a number of people who have kind of installed lights into their diorama, which again, they look great. But if you're a beginner with this, that might be a little bit too daunting, which is one of the reasons why I decided to make this diorama, just to show you how easy it is to make something that looks pretty effective and does kind of resemble an ice structure, just by using the styrofoam and a little bit of paint. So again, you can see here, I'm just adding more white. This time I'm not watering it down, just to the base of each of the crystals and just kind of flicking it up. And you can see then those crystals look much brighter, almost as if they are glowing, which is the effect that you want really. So here it is. This is the finished kind of painted piece. And it's really nice when you see some of the styrofoam coming through. So you got those kind of greyish patches, some of the cobalt blue, and then some of the white. And it just makes it look a little bit more interesting as a piece to look at. So it's not just kind of a pure white kind of colour. So here is the McFarlane Toys Metamorpho on the diorama. And I'm really happy with the way this turned out. I think this character is really striking against that kind of white and blue background because of the colours in the figure itself. But again, this would work with Superman, but it would also work with many other toy lines, as I'll show you in a moment with a figure from Masters of the Universe. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've got some kind of tips out of it. I hope it's encouraged you to have a go yourself. Please do leave a comment below if you enjoyed this, and please do like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Well, thank you for watching this video this far, and please do go and have a go and let me know how you get on. Well, thanks for watching. Bye for now. See you again soon.